The rain had already soaked through Owen Parker's shirt by the time he noticed the old man struggling at the far end of the hardware store parking lot, and he didn't think, he just went, the way he always did when something needed doing and nobody else was doing it. The old man was maybe 75, wiry, silver-haired, wrestling a pallet of concrete bags toward the bed of a pickup truck that sat too high for one person to load alone, his cane hooked over his forearm, his jaw set with the stubbornness of someone who refused to ask for help, even when his body had clearly stopped agreeing to the plan. Owen crossed the lot without a word, put his shoulder under the first bag, and started loading. The old man froze for half a second, genuinely startled, like kindness from a stranger was a foreign language he hadn't heard spoken aloud in years. And then he laughed, short and disbelieving, and said something Owen would remember for a long time afterward. "Son, you don't even know who I am." Owen just shrugged, water running off his jaw, and said the only thing that mattered to him. "Doesn't matter. You needed a hand." 12 bags later, both men soaked, the old man extended a weathered hand and introduced himself simply as Walter. He didn't offer a last name. He didn't need to, not yet. To find out who that old man really was, and what walking into that parking lot that evening would end up costing, and giving, a mechanic who'd stopped expecting anything good to happen to him, stay until the very end. If stories like this speak to you, the quiet ones, the ones about people who help without expecting anything back, I hope you'll stay with us through this one, because Owen's is worth the whole hour. 11 months earlier, Owen Parker's life looked nothing like a story anyone would tell. He was 34 years old, a mechanic at a family-owned auto shop on the edge of a town called Millbrook, and he was raising his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, alone, ever since a car accident on a wet November highway had taken his wife, Anna, 18 months before. Owen didn't talk about it. He didn't talk about much of anything, honestly. The men at the shop had learned early on that Owen worked with hands and his head down, that he was the best diagnostic mechanic any of them had ever seen, able to hear an engine's problem the way other men heard a song's wrong note, but that he'd go a whole shift saying maybe 40 words total, most of them about torque specs or oil viscosity. What none of them knew, because Owen had never told a single person in Millbrook, was that before Anna died, before he'd moved his daughter 3 states away to be near her grandmother for support, Owen Parker had been a senior product engineer, one of the sharpest minds in industrial hydraulics on the East Coast, with 2 patents to his name and a reputation that opened doors. He'd walked away from all of it, not because he'd failed, because after Anna died, he couldn't look at a corporate office building without feeling like the walls were closing in, and Lily needed a father who came home every night at 5:30, not one who chased promotions in a world that had kept spinning like nothing happened. So Owen fixed transmissions for a living now, and picked Lily up from first grade every day at 3, and made grilled cheese sandwiches cut into triangles because she liked triangles better than squares. And he told himself, most nights, that this was enough. That quiet, small, steady, that was enough. He didn't know, that rainy Tuesday evening, that the man he'd just helped load a truck was Walter Lawson, founder of Lawson Industrial Manufacturing, a company that employed 11,000 people across 4 states, and did nearly $2 billion in annual revenue, a company Walter had built from a single machine shop in 1974 and had only recently, reluctantly, handed over to his daughter to run. Walter had been at that hardware store because his driver had the night off, and his pride hadn't yet caught up to his knees, and he'd genuinely been prepared to load 200 pounds of concrete by himself, rather than admit he needed it. What struck him, as he sat in his truck afterward watching Owen jog back through the rain toward an old sedan where a small girl waited in a booster seat, wasn't the help itself. It was that Owen had never once asked what was in it for him. Walter had spent 40 years surrounded by people angling for something, a contract, a reference, a foot in the door, and here was a stranger who'd simply seen a problem and solved it, then walked away without leaving so much as his name. Walter didn't walk away that easily, though. 2 days later, he showed up at the auto shop, ostensibly to have his truck's brakes checked, and specifically requested the mechanic who'd helped him in the rain. Owen didn't recognize him at first, not out of the storm and the low light, but Walter recognized Owen instantly, and by the time the brake inspection was done, Walter had learned 3 things. That Owen's diagnosis of a faint vibration in the front axle was more precise than what 2 other shops had told him that year. That Owen mentioned his daughter twice and nothing about himself even once. And that Owen genuinely had no idea he'd spent an evening loading concrete for one of the most powerful men in the state's manufacturing sector. Walter found that last part delightful. He also found it, in a way he couldn't quite name yet, like something he'd been missing for a long time. A man who did the right thing simply because it was right there in front of him. Rebecca Lawson, meanwhile, had no idea her father had spent his Tuesday evening being rescued by a stranger in a hardware store parking lot, because Rebecca Lawson had spent that same evening in a conference room until nearly 10 o'clock, fighting to keep a $40 million supply contract from walking out the door over a labor dispute she'd inherited 8 months into her tenure as CEO. Rebecca was 36, sharp-edged in the particular way that women who inherit companies from famous fathers are often forced to become, because every decision she made was measured twice, once against the business logic, and once against the unspoken question of whether she deserved the chair she was sitting in. She'd taken over Lawson Industrial 18 months earlier, when Walter's heart had given him a scare he never fully told anyone about. And she had spent every day since proving, to a board that watched her like hawks, and to a workforce that still called her Walter's girl behind her back, that she hadn't gotten the job because of her last name. She loved her father fiercely and argued with him constantly, mostly about the same thing. That he still wouldn't let go, still wandered the old machine shop floor unannounced, still made decisions about people, hiring people, trusting people, based on instinct instead of due diligence, the way he always had. Rebecca ran on data, Walter ran on gut. It had worked for him for 40 years, and it terrified her that it might not work anymore in a company this size, in a market this unforgiving. So when Walter called her that Thursday and said, with an excitement in his voice she hadn't heard in months, "I met someone I think you should meet," Rebecca assumed, reasonably, given the last several times her father had gotten similarly excited, that he'd found some struggling little supplier he wanted the company to bail out on sentiment alone. "Dad," she said, already rubbing her temple, "I don't have time for another one of your strays." "He's not a stray," Walter said. "He's a mechanic. And I want you to have dinner with us Sunday." Rebecca did not, in that moment, imagine that dinner would change the direction of her entire life. She imagined, if anything, an obligation to sit through, a favor to her father, an hour she could spare, nothing more. She had no idea that the quiet man at that dinner table would end up seeing something in her that no one else had bothered to look for in years, underneath the boardroom armor. And she had no idea that she was about to walk into that first meeting, and within 20 minutes, say something to Owen Parker so dismissive, so wounding, that it would take her months to earn back the ground she'd lose in that single conversation. 3 days would pass before that dinner, and neither of them knew yet how much would hinge on it. The dinner was held at Walter's house on a Sunday evening in early spring, a sprawling but unpretentious property on the edge of town that had always felt, to Rebecca, more like a workshop with a kitchen attached than an executive's home. Her father had never cared much for showing off what he'd built. Owen arrived in the only collared shirt he owned that didn't have an oil stain somewhere on it, with Lily's hand in his, because Walter had specifically insisted the girl come too, and Owen wasn't about to leave his 6-year-old with a sitter for a dinner he still only half understood the purpose of. He'd learned by then, mostly from a coworker who'd looked Walter up out of curiosity, that the old man he'd helped was worth more money than Owen would make in 10 lifetimes turning wrenches, and the knowledge had made him uneasy rather than excited. Owen didn't want anything from Walter Lawson. He'd said as much, twice, and Walter had waved him off both times with the same phrase. "I didn't invite you here to give you anything. I invited you here because I like you." Rebecca arrived straight from the office, 40 minutes late, still in her charcoal suit, still mentally 3 conversations behind on a contract dispute that had eaten her entire weekend, and when she walked into her father's dining room and saw a mechanic in a plain shirt sitting across the table from a little girl in pigtails, something in her, exhaustion, maybe, or the particular defensiveness of someone who has spent all day being doubted and has no patience left for being managed, simply snapped into the wrong gear. "So you're the parking lot story," she said. Not quite unkindly, but not warmly either, sliding into her seat. "My father's told it 4 times this week." "It wasn't much of a story," Owen said. "Man needed help. I helped." "Right." Rebecca poured herself wine she didn't really want, mostly to have something to do with her hands. "And now you're at dinner with my father's company, practically hand-delivered to you on a plate, so I suppose it worked out." The table went quiet. Walter's jaw tightened. Owen didn't raise his voice. He never did. But something in his posture went very still, the way it did right before he said something he meant completely. "I didn't ask for a company," he said. "I didn't ask for anything. If you think I loaded a truck in the rain because I was angling for a seat at your table, you don't know the first thing about me, and that's fine, because we just met. But don't confuse not knowing me with knowing what kind of man I am." Rebecca opened her mouth to fire something back. She was good at that, better than almost anyone in a boardroom. But Lily, small and unbothered by the tension adults were so good at pretending wasn't obvious, looked up from her plate and asked Rebecca, with the devastating honesty of a 6-year-old, "Are you sad? You look sad." And Rebecca, for reasons she couldn't entirely explain even to herself later, felt her throat close up because she was sad, had been sad in some low, humming way for months that she hadn't had time to examine, and a child had noticed it in 4 seconds when the entire executive floor of her company hadn't noticed it in a year. The dinner ended early. Rebecca left first, offering a clipped goodbye and nothing more. Owen drove home with Lily asleep in her booster seat and didn't think much of it. He assumed, reasonably, that this was the last he'd see of Rebecca Lawson, and he told himself that was fine, that he hadn't wanted anything from that family to begin with. What Owen didn't know was that the true cost of that dinner wasn't going to land on him. It landed on Walter 3 weeks later, at the company's spring shareholder briefing, when a boardroom disagreement over a struggling manufacturing line, one Walter had quietly funneled resources into for sentimental reasons, keeping an aging plant with an aging workforce afloat past the point it made financial sense, finally came to a head. Rebecca, under pressure from the board to cut the underperforming line, made the call to shut it down, a call that was defensible on every spreadsheet, and devastating to the 212 people who worked there, many of whom had been with the company since Walter hired them personally decades earlier. Walter found out about the closure from an email, not a conversation, and it was the first time in the company's history that a decision of that size had been made without him in the room. He didn't yell. Walter never yelled, not in 40 years of running the company. He simply sat down with Rebecca in her office that evening and said, quietly, that he understood the numbers, that he even understood the necessity, but that he no longer recognized the company he was watching her run. A company that had once prided itself on not being the kind of place that discarded people the moment they stopped being convenient. Rebecca, defensive and exhausted and still smarting from weeks of being second-guessed by a board that trusted her father's instincts over her own analysis, told him something she would regret before the words had even finished leaving her mouth, that maybe the company needed someone who could make hard decisions without getting sentimental about strangers in parking lots. It was a low blow, aimed at Owen without naming him, and Walter absorbed it silently and left her office without another word. For the first time since taking over, Rebecca went home that night to an empty apartment and felt, with total clarity, completely alone in the position she'd fought so hard to earn. She had won the argument. She had also, without entirely meaning to, humiliated the one person whose approval she'd spent her whole life quietly chasing and pushed away. With one careless sentence at a dinner table weeks earlier, a man who had done nothing but show her, and her father, decency for no reason at all. Neither Rebecca nor Owen spoke to each other in the weeks that followed. Owen went back to his ordinary rhythm, the shop, Lily's school pickups, the small, steady life he'd built out of the wreckage of the one he'd lost. He assumed, without bitterness, that people like the Lawsons and people like him simply didn't mix, that the dinner had been an interesting evening and nothing more. 8 months would pass before the crack in that silence finally split wide open, and before Rebecca Lawson would have to face just how much that one dismissive sentence at dinner had already cost her. The 8 months that followed weren't quiet for Rebecca, even if her outward composure suggested otherwise. The board pressed her harder after the plant closure, some quietly satisfied to see her make the tough call they felt Walter never would have, others using it as ammunition to question whether she had her father's feel for the people side of the business at all. Rebecca won every argument in every room she walked into that year, and somehow felt smaller after each one. Walter, for his part, didn't bring up Owen again, didn't push, didn't lecture. He simply grew quieter around his daughter in a way that unsettled her more than any confrontation would have. The particular disappointment of a parent who loves you too much to say what he's actually thinking. It was Diane, Walter's longtime executive assistant of nearly 20 years, who finally said something Rebecca couldn't unhear. Diane had been the one to type up Walter's account of that rainy parking lot evening for the internal newsletter. A small piece Walter had insisted on running, about kindness and the people who build companies without knowing it. And she mentioned to Rebecca, almost in passing one afternoon while dropping off files, that your father hasn't smiled the way he did that week in months, you know. He talks about that mechanic and his little girl more than he talks about the fourth quarter numbers. Rebecca brushed it off at the time, but it stayed lodged in her somewhere, the way small true things do. The second thread pulled loose from an unexpected direction. Rebecca had assigned a young analyst named Priya to review vendor contracts tied to the shuttered plant, mostly routine cleanup work, and Priya came back with something odd. The plant's closure, on paper, had saved the company less than projected, because a maintenance contractor Rebecca's team had brought in to replace internal staff was billing at nearly triple the rate of the mechanics who'd been let go. Mechanics whose actual diagnostic accuracy, according to old maintenance logs Priya had dug up out of curiosity, had been remarkably high. One name on those old logs kept appearing in the margin notes as the person other technicians would quietly ask to double-check a diagnosis before signing off on a repair. O. Parker. Rebecca stared at that name for a long moment before it clicked. The mechanic. Her father's stranger from the rain. It wasn't proof of anything grand. It was a small, human coincidence, a thread of competence running quietly under a decision she'd made for reasons that had nothing to do with him. But it cracked something open in her anyway, the way small true things do when you're already carrying guilt you haven't looked at directly. She drove to Millbrook on a Thursday evening in early autumn, unannounced, and found Owen in the shop's back bay, elbow deep in a transmission, Lily doing homework at a folding table in the corner because after-school care had fallen through that day, and Owen had simply brought her to work, the way he always managed to make things work without complaint. Rebecca stood in the doorway for a moment before he noticed her. "I owe you an apology," she said, no preamble, because she'd rehearsed a dozen versions of this on the drive over and none of them had survived contact with actually seeing him. "For dinner. For what I said. It was cruel, and it wasn't about you, not really. It was about everything else I was carrying that night. And I took it out on the one person at that table who'd done absolutely nothing to deserve it." Owen wiped his hands on a rag and looked at her for a long moment, and Lily, watching from her folding table with the frank curiosity of a child, said nothing at all, which was somehow louder than anything she could have said. "I don't need an apology," Owen said finally, "and it wasn't cold, just honest. I need you to understand something, though. I've spent my whole life being the guy people look past, the quiet one, the one who fixes things and doesn't say much. That's fine. I chose that, after my wife died, because I needed a life small enough that I could actually hold it together for my daughter. What I won't do is sit at a table and be talked about like I'm a charity case your father picked up off the street. If you came here for absolution, you've got it. But if you came here because you're genuinely curious who I am, that's a different conversation, and I'm not sure you've earned it yet." There it was, not anger, not a grand confrontation, just Owen's quiet, immovable clarity. And it landed on Rebecca harder than any boardroom argument ever had, because nobody in her professional life spoke to her that plainly anymore. Everyone managed her. Owen simply told her the truth. There's something almost old-fashioned about a man who won't perform for anyone, even to smoothing things over, and it's worth asking honestly whether we've lost too much of that ourselves in a world that rewards the smooth answer over the true one. She didn't push for more that night. She left with a simple request. Could she come by again, not to talk business, just to understand? And Owen, against his better instincts, said yes. mostly because Lily had already decided she liked the serious woman in the nice coat, and told her so on the way out. Rebecca came back the following week, and the week after, not with apologies this time, but with small ordinary things. She picked up Lily's favorite snack from the store once without being asked. She sat quietly in the shop's waiting area doing her own work. While Owen finished a job, she asked Owen questions about hydraulics that revealed, slowly, that she'd done her homework and found his old patents, and that she was stunned a man with his background was spending his talent on brake pads and oil changes in a town most executives couldn't find on a map. Owen deflected the questions about his past the way he always did, but he noticed, too, that Rebecca Lawson without the boardroom armor was sharper, funnier, and far more unguarded than the woman who'd wounded him at that dinner table, and that Lily lit up every time her car pulled into the lot. Then, just as something real seemed to be taking root, the company's second crisis of the year landed on Rebecca's desk. A federal safety audit triggered by an equipment failure at one of the plants, one that traced, uncomfortably, back to a maintenance shortcut approved under the same contractor Rebecca had brought in after the layoffs. It threatened not just fines but the credibility of her entire leadership. At the exact moment the board was already circling. 1 month later, an ordinary Thursday afternoon would change everything neither of them had said out loud yet, because the audit findings were about to hand Rebecca no choice but to go back to the very shop floor, and the very man she'd once dismissed as beneath her attention. The federal audit report landed on Rebecca's desk on a Thursday morning, 240 pages of technical findings that her legal team summarized in the plainest terms available as the company's outsourced maintenance contractor had been falsifying inspection logs on hydraulic press systems for over a year, a shortcut that had directly caused the equipment failure under investigation and could easily have caused far worse. Rebecca sat with that knowledge for exactly one afternoon before she understood, with the particular clarity of someone finally seeing a mistake in full daylight, that the 212 people she'd let go 8 months earlier, mechanics, technicians, the kind of people whose margin notes had kept machines honest for decades, had been quietly replaced by a company cutting corners nobody had been left in the building to catch. She called Owen directly, not through an assistant, and asked him, not as a favor to her father, not as a courtesy, but as a professional request, whether he'd be willing to review the technical findings and tell her, plainly, what he saw. Owen drove to the company's headquarters for the first time in his life the following morning, in his work boots, feeling entirely out of place in a lobby with a 2-story marble waterfall, and spent 4 hours in a conference room, going through pressure logs and maintenance records, line by line, while a room full of engineers, with far more prestigious degrees than his own, watched a mechanic from Millbrook find, in under an hour, 3 separate points of falsified data that their own internal review had missed entirely. He didn't gloat. He didn't say a word about the layoffs. Didn't mention that the very technicians whose competence had once kept these machines safe were the ones the company had shown the door. He simply laid out, with the same quiet precision he brought to every engine he'd ever diagnosed, exactly where the safety margins had been cut, exactly what it would take to fix it properly, and exactly which of the old maintenance protocols he recognized, because they were close cousins of systems he'd helped design over a decade earlier at a different company, needed to be restored rather than reinvented. It was one of the younger engineers in that room, a sharp, earnest woman named Priya, the same analyst who'd flagged the contractor's billing months earlier, who finally said what everyone else in the room was thinking but too polite to voice. "Wait, you designed the load balancing protocol we used at Halverson Dynamics. I studied that system in grad school. That was you?" The room went quiet. Rebecca, standing at the back near the door, felt something shift in her chest that she didn't have a tidy word for yet. She'd known, vaguely, that Owen had an engineering background from what she'd found online. She hadn't fully understood, until that exact moment, watching a room of credentialed professionals look at him with something close to reverence, that the man who'd spent 8 months quietly changing brake pads in Millbrook had once been one of the most respected minds in his field, and had walked away from all of it, without a trace of resentment, without ever once trying to trade on it to get ahead. Owen confirmed it simply. Yes, that had been him, a long time ago, before his life took a different shape, and offered no further explanation, Because the explanation wasn't the point of the meeting, and he wasn't going to make it one now. But the unraveling that Rebecca had been half-consciously circling for months finally caught up with her fully that afternoon, in the quiet after the meeting, alone in her office with the door shut. She thought about the dinner where she'd humiliated him in front of her father. She thought about the plant closure and the 212 people whose competence had been discarded on a spreadsheet while a contractor's falsified paperwork had nearly caused a catastrophic failure. She thought about her father's quiet disappointment for 8 straight months, a disappointment she now understood completely because she'd spent that whole year proving she could run the company like it alone, and it had taken one afternoon with an underestimated mechanic to show her exactly what that approach had cost. There's a real question worth sitting with here, whether the newer, faster, more credentialed way of doing things is actually better than the slower wisdom of the people who've simply been doing the work the longest, or whether companies lose something real every time they trade experience for a line on a budget sheet. She found Owen in the parking garage that evening, loading his own toolbox into his truck bed, the same easy, unbothered competence she'd first glimpsed in her father's account of a rainy hardware store lot. Only now she understood the full weight of what that competence actually represented, and what it had cost him to keep it hidden for so long. "I owe you a real apology this time," Rebecca said. "Not the one I gave you at the shop. That was about my behavior. This one's about everything I got wrong, about you, about the people we let go, about what I thought running this company well actually meant." Owen set the toolbox down and looked at her for a long moment, the parking garage fluorescents flickering faintly overhead. And for the first time since they'd met, something in his usual stillness gave way just slightly. Not to anger, not even to forgiveness exactly, but to something more like recognition. Two people who had both spent a long time protecting themselves by staying quiet, finally seeing each other clearly. "You didn't just get me wrong," Owen said. "You let go of 200 people who were the reason nothing like this had happened before. If you want to fix this, that's where you start. Not with me." Rebecca nodded slowly, and something settled in her, a decision crystallizing that would cost her more than she yet fully realized. With the board, with the numbers, with the version of herself she'd built her entire leadership around for 18 months. 2 months later, in front of the very people whose trust she'd have to rebuild from nothing, Rebecca Lawson would stand up in a room and do something no one at Lawson Industrial had seen a CEO do in a very long time: admit publicly that she'd been wrong. The company town hall was held on a gray Tuesday morning in the same plant that had been shuttered 8 months earlier, reopened now under emergency circumstances after the audit forced Rebecca's hand, and every one of the 212 former employees had been personally invited back, not with a form letter, but with a phone call from Rebecca herself, made over 3 long days, one by one. Not all of them came. Some had already found other work. Some were too hurt to walk back through those doors. But 163 of them did, filling the folding chairs set up on the factory floor between the machines Owen had spent the better part of a month helping recalibrate to the old protocols, the ones that actually worked. Rebecca stood in front of them without notes. She told them, plainly, that she'd made a decision 8 months earlier, based on numbers that looked right on paper and were wrong in every way that mattered. That she had discarded decades of hands-on competence because she'd been too afraid of looking soft to trust the instincts her own father had built this company on, and that the falsified safety data uncovered by the federal audit was a direct consequence of that mistake, one that could have cost far more than jobs if it hadn't been caught in time. She didn't hide behind corporate language. She used the words mistake and wrong and I'm sorry in front of the board members seated in the back row who had spent a year pushing her toward exactly the decision she was now publicly renouncing, and she watched several of them shift uncomfortably in their seats, because this wasn't the language of a CEO protecting her position. It was the language of someone choosing honesty over convenience, at real cost to how she'd be perceived in that room going forward. Then she did something that hadn't been on the agenda at all. She asked Owen Parker to come up and say a few words, not as a favor, not as decoration for her apology, but because, she told the room, Most of what she'd learned about running this company honestly over the past 2 months had come from watching a mechanic from Millbrook do quiet, careful work without ever once asking for credit. Owen hadn't prepared anything. He stood in front of 163 people he'd never met and said simply that he understood what it felt like to be told your work didn't matter anymore, that he'd carried that feeling himself for a long time after losing things he couldn't get back, and that the only thing that had ever gotten him through it was doing the work well anyway, even when nobody was watching, because that was the only part of it that was really his to control. He thanked no one, asked for nothing, and sat back down. It was, by any measure, the least polished speech given in that building all year, and it was the one people would talk about for months afterward. Afterward, in her office, Rebecca offered Owen something showy, a formal position, a director-level title in the company's engineering division, a salary that would have changed his and Lily's life financially overnight. Owen turned it down, gently, and asked for something else instead. That the company formally reinstate the internal maintenance protocols that had been cut, staff them with the technicians who'd been let go, and create a standing review board, made up of floor technicians, not just executives, with real authority to flag safety shortcuts before they became disasters. Rebecca agreed to all of it and added one more thing on her own. Owen's name, quietly restored to the original patent filings from his previous company, a correction he hadn't asked for and hadn't expected, made simply because it was true and it was overdue. The quiet coda came 4 months later, on an ordinary Saturday in early spring, almost a full year after that rainy evening in the hardware store parking lot. Walter sat on his porch watching Owen and Rebecca, married now, in a small ceremony that had nothing showy about it at all, teach Lily, 7 years old now, how to check the oil in an old truck that had once belonged to Walter himself. The same truck Owen had loaded with concrete bags the night this whole story began. Lily wiped her hands on a rag the same way she'd watched her father do 1,000 times, and Rebecca laughed at something Owen said, easily, the particular ease of someone who had finally stopped needing to prove anything to anyone in the room. Walter didn't say much, he didn't need to. He just watched, the way he had that first rainy night, a man who'd built an empire out of instinct, finally getting to see, up close, the one investment that had never been about the numbers at all. If there's one thing this story asks of you, it's this. Think about the people in your own life who've been quietly overlooked. A coworker written off as just the maintenance guy. A neighbor everyone assumed had nothing much going on. Someone whose steadiness got mistaken for having nothing to offer. Has someone like that ever crossed your path? Someone you only really saw once you slowed down long enough to look? We'd love to hear who they were. In the comments, even if all you can do now is finally give them the credit you didn't think to give them at the time. And if stories about quiet, decent people finally getting truly seen are ones you want more of, we'd be glad to have you stick around for the next one. There's always another overlooked hero worth finding. Owen Parker never did go back to corporate engineering full-time. He still works some mornings at the Millbrook shop, mostly out of habit. Mostly because he likes the quiet of it, and because some of the men there still don't know, and probably never will, exactly who he used to be. He's never minded that. He never needed the world to know his worth. He only ever needed one person to see it, and eventually he got two. His daughter, who'd known it all along, and a woman who'd once dismissed him at a dinner table, and spent the rest of her life grateful she got the chance to be wrong about him.